let's move straight on to our Muqaddimatul Ula, as we had covered the opening of the book, Khutbatul Kitab of Ibn Juzayy rahmatullah alayh, and then he's told us that he has placed at the start of his book 2 introductions, and the second of those introductions is his linguistic or his vocabulary introduction, al-lughat, or his lexicon or his glossary almost, right? So that itself is interesting, but to a certain extent we were covering it by coming back and forth while reading the Tafsir. It is something that we could also read at a later point in its own right, because what's interesting about the lughat introduction, as he says, and we can just go back just a page to where he says regarding his introductions, that فيما كثر دوره من اللغات الواقعة في القرآن. So lughat here doesn't mean dialects, as it often does, or languages, but it means items of language, right? And so it's vocabulary. And what you can see sometimes is that a particular word appears in the Quran with multiple meanings, right? So we have, on the one hand, the task of trying to understand a word and how its meaning is unified through the Quran, so understanding them in relation to each other, so to recognize how that word or how the root of that word has a central meaning, which then we can recognize whenever it pops up in the Quran. So that's where we're looking at it in terms of how that word is understood across the board, or to put it another way, the sort of kulli approach, the universal approach. On the other hand, sometimes a word appears with a number of different meanings. And though there may be something that unifies them at the core, it's important to recognize that this word in this other place doesn't mean what we took it to mean in the other verse, right? So this is where we have something called al-wujuh wal-nadha'ir, al-wujuh wal-nadha'ir, which the fancy English word for it is polysemi. And that is to say, a particular word might mean a number of different things in different places, in different contexts. So the word huda, for example, As-Suyuti lists as having 17 or 18 different meanings. Now, in reality, you could say at the same time, at the core, it still means the same thing, which is guidance, but it has some different references or reference. And so there's subtlety in the differences. An example that came up, someone was asking me the other day about how Professor Abdul Halim has translated al-alameen in a certain verse as being all the nations, right? And it's not crossing my mind right now which verse he was asking me about. But it's not in the Fatiha, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. It was another ayah where al-alameen was understood to mean the nations. And the questioner was surprised about this because al-alameen in most translations would be the worlds. Now, of course, when it comes to the Fatiha, it's very natural to translate it as Lord of the Worlds, because the meaning should be seen as broad as possible, right? That he is the Rabb, he is the Lord, the Master, the nurturer and sustainer of everything. So the word worlds is quite appropriate here, right? And there's something to be investigated about the word alam and then the nature of this word. It seems to be a plural, seems to be a person plural, right? Rather than awalim, a broken plural. So these are investigations which we'll put to one side for now. But just to say, if you translate it there as worlds, it would be very natural. Not all the translators go that way, of course. But then in certain other ayat, it'd be very hard to see worlds. When the people of Lut come to him and say, Alam nanhaka anil alameen, or when certain people are told that they were favored over the alameen, like Bani Israel, or where Maryam alayhi salam is told, وَاصْطَفَاكِ عَلَى نِسَاءِ الْعَالَمِينَ, that he has chosen and selected you and raised you over the women of the worlds. In this case, no, it's not. You're not going to think of worlds as planets or something like that, interplanetary women or something like this. But the idea would still be some other conception of worlds if you were to use that word. But it would be far more natural to understand it in these contexts as the nations and communities, right? So this is what we call al-wujuh wal-nadha'ir. So words might have different meanings, indications, connotations, reference in different occurrences as they appear in the Mus'haf, right? Now, also before we come into al-Muqaddimat al-Ula, Ibn Juzayy has talked about some of the sources that he's referred to, but he hasn't actually named any sources here. He's talked about amongst the ulama, amongst the mufassirin, there are those who spoke at length, and there are those who were much briefer and preferred to be concise. So these are generalities. Now, of course, in terms of understanding which sources that he was referring to, there are a few very important ones which we have to know as readers of Ibn Juzayy, so that we can clarify certain things by going back to those sources. And that's something that we've done a lot in our readings so far throughout the first 4 surahs of the Quran. So among those important sources is the Tafsir of Zamakhshari, which is the basis for a great deal of tafsir. In fact, almost all of tafsir that comes after Zamakhshari draws from and is indebted to the work that Zamakhshari did in terms of his linguistic analysis for the most part, and other things, but in particular his linguistic treatment of the Quran. So even those who were so opposed to his theological leanings, as he's a Mu'tazili, still used him even as the prop to argue against in these matters, right? But at the same time, his linguistic analysis becomes the basis of the major tafsir that come after. So Ibn Juzayy is no different in that respect, right? And then among the other sources that he uses a lot is the tafsir of Ibn Atiyah. Ibn Atiyah is a contemporary of Zamakhshari, around the same time anyway, and is closer to Ibn Juzayy in terms of orientation, being Spanish, but not really that, more to the fact that he is Maliki. And so the Ibn Atiyah's tafsir is one which is far more extensive, and to a large extent we can see that Ibn Juzayy is taking opinions that Ibn Atiyah lists and mentions and just condensing his points. So sometimes when we find something that's almost too concise in Ibn Juzayy for us to grasp at the first glance, it helps a lot to go to Ibn Atiyah. Zamakhshari, Ibn Atiyah, and also At-Tabari. I haven't seen it too much myself, but I'm reliably informed that among the core sources are At-Tabari for him, especially for, and not just for narrations. I mean, this is also something which people say a little bit flippantly about At-Tabari, that Imam At-Tabari's tafsir is just narrations. It really, really isn't. It's a lot more than that. But among the special features of At-Tabari's tafsir and the value that it holds to subsequent mufassirin is that he gathers so many narrations that are pertinent to tafsir from the early authorities, right? So keep those in mind, and those are things that we do refer back to when we are trying to get a handle on Ibn Juzay's ibarat. So that's one approach, is to look back at the sources of the mufassir. Another approach is to look at subsequent mufassirin, right? So on some tafsirs, there are those who actually wrote directly shuruh, or what we generally call hawashi, okay, marginal commentaries on the tafsir works. So I don't believe that Ibn Juzay's tafsir is one of those that has hawashi on it. If I'm wrong, hopefully we'll get the information on this. But of course, Zamakhshari's tafsir is, has got so many hawashi on it. The tafsir of Baydawi, which is to a very large extent based on Zamakhshari's, has a great deal of hawashi on it as well. And Baydawi also drew from Tafsir al-Razi, and al-Razi also depended to a large extent on Zamakhshari. So there's a lot of relationship between these core tafsir which form the center of the tafsir curriculum, right? So hawashi are like direct explanations of a tafsir text, and they have their own materials and additional things as well. And the person writing the hashia may indeed be wanting to almost think of it as his own commentary, but he still takes the ibara of the musannif as the basis for those explorations. But then there's also subsequent tafsir that may just refer back to Ibn Juzayy, for example, and quote from him. I don't know, again, if that is very common to see people quoting Ibn Juzayy directly. That may be more true within the Andalusian tradition of tafsir. It's a matter which I haven't investigated in any depth. So let's leave that as a generality that I'm making here, right? An earlier mufassir we can understand by looking at later mufassirin. So in my my day job, this is my night job, right, teaching Ibn Juzayy. In my day job of translating Tafsir al-Razi, that's something that I have to do a lot. I try to look at the sources that he drew from, and I look at people who quoted him later. What did they understand by what he said? How did they comment on it? And how does that help me to understand the mas'ala as well as his wording itself? Okay, so with that we can go on to our Muqaddimatul Ula, and he has there 12 chapters. And these chapters can be seen to be in Ulum al-Quran. They can be seen to be in Usul al-Tafsir, more specifically, right? So to reiterate, and somebody asked me this question, just to reiterate that, Ulum al-Quran is a broader concept than Usul al-Tafsir. If you take a book like Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran, which I mentioned before, of Imam al-Suyuti, there are 80 anwa' of Ulum al-Quran. And among them, there are some which were specifically written as about al-Tafsir wal-Mufassirin. Okay? So that's an obvious subset of Ulum al-Quran. In addition to that, there are numerous chapters within Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran which actually are about tafsir, but that might not have been made explicit. And there are things that might not be about tafsir, but certainly have a strong bearing on tafsir and can be instrumentalized towards engaging in tafsir. And that's a certain amount of work that still needs to be done, as I've talked to you before about how usul al-tafsir needs to be consolidated and developed and made fit for purpose, the purpose being the continuing existence of tafsir in our world. Then we can make use of these source texts like Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran to see all the things that have been said that are pertinent to tafsir and just express that in terms of tafsir. So I hope to illustrate that. To a certain extent, I did that in my PhD thesis, which I will refer back to from time to time, especially in chapter 4 of that thesis, where I have looked at methods and genres from Ulum al-Quran and adjacent genres, how those actually lead towards a method and process in doing tafsir, specifically tafsir al-Quran bil-Quran, which was the subset of the matter that I looked at in my PhD research. The same idea can be further extended to other aspects of tafsir, especially all the linguistic tools in Al-Itqan. وَأُبَشِّرُكُمْ, I will give you the good news that I have translated the second volume out of Al-Itqan fi Ulum al-Quran. I keep promising you I'm going on to Al-Muqaddimah, but there are a few of my own Muqaddimat. So there is a common 4-volume edition of Al-Itqan, and out of that, the second volume would cover chapters 36 to 42. Those chapters I have translated into English, and those chapters are very much to do with the language of the Quran, right? So 36 is about Gharib al-Quran, right? So Gharib is, I like to call it uncommon expressions. So that is to say, not strange, but just like things that are not necessarily spoken by all the Arabs. So some of them considered it strange, Gharib, they were not familiar with it, right? So then it's basically about the vocabulary of the Quran. And then 37 and 38 are about things within the Quran, the Arabic Quran, which are from dialects other than the central dialect or Qurayshi dialect, so various dialects that exist, and also words that came from outside of Arabic, so foreign words or loan words in the Arabic language, or depending on how you want to look at it, foreign words in the Quran, but generally scholars don't prefer to put it in that way. So then we've got the Al-Wujuh wal-Nadha'ir, which I mentioned to you. There's a chapter on that. And then there is al-adawat, which is instruments, or mainly things like particles, huruf al-jar, and different kinds of huruf al-nasb, all the different particles which and instruments, linguistic instruments, which have have their effect in Quranic language. This actually is a hugely important chapter, and it seems kind of insane to translate it to English, but it was my job, so I did it. But alhamdulillah, I hope that I did it well, and with the purpose in mind, right? So I wasn't just trying, to get it off my back, the responsibility and the burden of being employed to do so, but rather it was in my mind that one day this will be used in a seminary context, right? A teaching context, a training context. So inshallah, in due course, when we're able to share this translation with you, it will form a basis for actually learning about Quran translation through the translation of these adawat and awamil Qur'aniyya wa Arabiyya. And 42, chapter 42 is, 41 I missed out, is al-i'rab. And both 40 and 41 are actually summarized from Mughni al-Labib. Mughni al-Labib is a book by Ibn Hisham, which is about the i'rab of the Quran. So Suyuti condensed the content of that book, a hugely important, influential book, into these two chapters. So essentially what I've got here is a translation of a summary of Mughni al-Labib, right? And then 42 is various rules pertaining to things like pronouns and plurals and various things that are also about the language of the Quran. So my intention is to take this and to make it a bilingual edition, which will pertain to linguistic exegesis of the Quran. So it will be usul for linguistic interpretation of the Quran, but because it's translated, it will be also usul for translation of the Quran, right? Based on the language in particular, and then of course translation of the Quran takes into account other things more widely than that. So it's not available yet, but if I have some good discussion with publishers, maybe in about a year, inshallah, we could try to get that out, bi'ithnillahi ta'ala. And then it will be a course, we'll teach it as well. Right, why did I get onto that? Because we were talking about muqaddimatul ula. I don't know why I got onto it. There was definitely a good reason. But I should tell you that there is a translation of the first volume. Now, when I hold this up, I don't want you to take it as a recommendation. I want you to take it as the opposite of recommendation. Okay, this is so don't screenshot this and then post it that I recommended it. I have to make maybe an angry face, so that just to show that I'm not recommending this book. This is a translation that was done and it was published some years ago out of Qatar, and let me see, 2011. And it's an absolute abomination of a translation. It is absolutely chock full of errors, top to bottom. The people who did it, unfortunately, did not know what they're doing. That's the long and short of it. One of the translators is actually an open Islamophobe. And I don't know why such a person would have been tasked by a Muslim center for the Muslim contribution to civilization to translate one of the core texts of our civilization. And on top of that, to translate some of the most sensitive chapters pertaining to revelation, the nature of revelation. And he's done a really, really terrible job. And I've analyzed that in some depth, but also a number of academics have written reviews of this book, which are very negative. Andrew Rippin, Hina Azam, Stephen Burge, they have written very negative reviews of this translation, but not negative enough in reality. And two of them, I have had maybe three now, I had the opportunity to tell them that their reviews were actually too kind and too gentle on how bad this translation is. I feel like doing a course just fully on how not to translate based on the perfect guide to the sciences of the Quran. So this needs to be redone, but we'll see if that's something we have the opportunity to do in the future. But volume 2, which was under my responsibility, I will claim I will claim is a good translation, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And it was also reviewed by a senior professor who gave me a lot of helpful feedback and guidance along the way. Right. So مقدمة الأولى فيها 12 بابا الباب الأول في نزول القرآن وجمعه في المصحف. So yeah, in order to clarify some points from Ibn Juzay's first introduction, I have also had a little look at Al-Itqan for one point in particular, which I'll tell you about when we get there. But let's try to make a good progress, inshallah, with this.
الباب الأول في نزول القرآن وجمعه في المصحف ونقطه وتحزيبه وتعشيره وذكر أسمائه. نزل القرآن على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من أول ما بعثه الله بمكة وهو ابن 40 سنة إلى أن هاجر إلى المدينة، ثم نزل عليه بالمدينة إلى أن توفاه الله، فكانت مدة نزوله عليه 20 سنة، وقيل كانت 23 سنة على حسب الاختلاف في سنه صلى الله عليه وسلم يوم توفي، هل كان ابن 60 سنة أو 63. وكان ربما تنزل عليه سورة كاملة وربما تنزل عليه آيات متفرقات، فيضم صلى الله عليه وسلم بعضها إلى بعض حتى تكمل السورة. وأول ما نزل من القرآن صدر سورة العلق، ثم المدثر والمزمل، وقيل أول ما نزل المدثر، وقيل فاتحة الكتاب، والأول هو الصحيح لما ورد في الحديث الصحيح عن عائشة رضي الله عنها في حديثها الطويل في ابتداء الوحي قالت فيه.
Right, so before we come to read that hadith, let's just have a quick review of the translation up till now. There's some issues with the heading here of the chapter. So in the translation, we've got some kind of smooshing. Smooshing is a word that I use. I don't know if it's a technical word or even an English word, but yeah, different parts have been smooshed together. And we have got here a longer title than we've been given in the translation. And then Nazal al-Quran here is given to us as a statement, not as part of the title. So not on the revelation of the Quran, but the Quran was sent, or the Quran came down upon the Messenger of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So we're going to have to fix that. From the beginning, when Allah commissioned him in Mecca when he was 40 years old until he emigrated to Medina, then it was revealed to Medina until Allah Azza wa took him. I mean, yeah, that's, took him back, or, that might be fine. The period during which it was revealed to him was 20 years or 23 years, according to disagreement on the age. Okay, so then there's a reference in the footnotes, which is handy. Sometimes an entire surah would be revealed to him, sometimes separate verses, so we join them to others. So, okay, so this is a very literal way of saying something, some of them to others. Okay, that's like taking the Arabic expression and just carrying it across literally. Let's see how it is. Look. فَيَضُمُّ بَعْضَهَا إِلَى بَعْض. So some to some. But that's not how we should translate this. He would join them to each other, or he would gather them together. That's how we would say it in English. Right? Not some to some. Some to some is Arabic. Some to some. Right? البعض إلى بعض. But we don't say that in English. The first thing that was revealed, so it's not revealed to him, it's not in the text here. وَأَوْلُ مَا نَزَلَ مِنَ الْقُرْآنِ. So although there's nothing wrong with saying that, but just it's not there. Was the beginning of Surah Al-Alaq, then Al-Muddathir and Al-Muzammil. Okay, so we'd want the numbers. Then Al-Muddathir, which is 74, and then Al-Muzammil, which is 73, right? It has been said that the first to be revealed, so this is something that happens a lot in this translation. When Ibn Juzayy says waqila, then he's giving you another opinion, right? And generally a weaker opinion in his view than the first one. So we can't just say it was said, it was said, it was said, it was said. At least you have to keep the and it was said. Or the way I would do it is, it was also said. When you say it was also said, you've got that sense of tamrid, which we are intending with waqila. Okay. Sometimes I go with a different way of rendering that, such as another view is that. Okay. So we'd have to say it has also been said. Otherwise, it just you end up saying it is said, it is said, it is said, and then you don't have a sense of the priority between these sayings. And it has been said the Fatiha of the book. Okay, which is of course chapter 1. Okay, but then it's kind of seems a bit funny to even say that, but I'll put it in for now. The former is the truth, meaning to say the first opinion is the correct one, which would sound a lot better, wouldn't it? The former is the truth, because of what has been narrated in the authentic hadith. Okay, what has been narrated in authentic hadith from Aisha in the very long hadith. So there's a repetition there, which comes from the Arabic, but then, but it should be sort of reworded in English to avoid that strange expression. And it says hadith al-tawil. It didn't say very long. Okay. So this is the hadith.
جاءه الملك وهو بغار حراء قال اقرأ قال ما أنا بقارئ قال فأخذني فغطني حتى بلغ مني الجهد ثم أرسلني فقال اقرأ قلت ما أنا بقارئ قال فأخذني فغطني الثانية حتى بلغ مني الجهد ثم أرسلني فقال اقرأ قلت ما أنا بقارئ قال فأخذني فغطني الثالثة حتى بلغ مني الجهد ثم أرسلني فقال اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم فرجع بها رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ترجف بوادره فقال زملوني زملوني فزملوه حتى ذهب عنه ما يجد من الروعة.
Okay, so this is generally fine. Balagha min al-jahd is, distressed could be a way of saying that in short. Al-alaq, it's not necessarily a bad translation, but it's just we want to check against how they've translated it elsewhere as well, and how Ibn Juzayy understands al-alaq. Tarjufu bawadiruhu is a trembling rather than, not necessarily referring to the heart. Bawadir, according to the footnote here, is like between your shoulders and or shoulder blades and neck. Okay, so okay, and then another version of the hadith.
وفيه رواية من طريق جابر بن عبد الله فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم زملوني فأنزل الله يا أيها المدثر.
Okay, so here we have got, the narration is saying zammiluni and then al-muddathir. Okay, so maybe slightly not what you expect. You might expect they were going to refer to al-muzammil, but of course in terms of meaning there's no difficulty here.
وأما آخر ما نزل من القرآن فسورة إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح وقيل آية الربا التي في البقرة وقيل الآية التي قبلها.
Right, so I looked up this mas'ala here a little bit because he's saying regarding the last thing to be revealed was Surah An-Nasr. Okay, when he says that, he's not referring to the ayah, he's referring to the surah. So I would not, although that's, so I would say the chapter, he's not saying that the first ayah of Surah An-Nasr was the last thing to be revealed. In fact, he even says that, look, فَسُورَةُ إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ, and they in the translation didn't keep that. And it has also been said, okay, they've put also here, that it was the verse of usury which are. The verse of usury which are. هذا ليس بإنجلش. Okay, so either verses which are or verse which is. So the issue here is that when he says ayatul riba, does he mean one ayah, which is called ayatul riba, or does he mean a passage? Because sometimes they would, you know, with tajawuz, they would say ayatu kada, and they mean like a little extended portion, a passage, right? So that's fine. It could refer to 257 to 258. Now, Imam Suyuti in his chapter on this, he mentions that when some of the Salaf have said the last thing to be revealed was ayatul riba, they meant this portion of verses, right? So that's a reasonable interpretation of what Ibn Juzayy is saying here. But then he says, وَقِيلَ الْآيَةُ الَّتِي قَبْلَهَا. Right. Now, sometimes also, as Suyuti notes, the ayatul riba may refer specifically to which one? I've written it down. Specifically to 278, right? So to 278. And then if you were to go with that here, Afwan, I'm hitting the mic, I hope I didn't make too much noise. If we were to go with that, then the verse before it would be 277, naturally. So is there an opinion that the last thing to, so there is an opinion that the last thing to be revealed was 278, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullaha wa dharu ma baqiya min al-riba in kuntum mu'minin. That could be the last ayah. But is there an opinion that says 277, إن الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وأقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة لهم أجرهم عند ربهم ولا خوف عليهم ولا هم يحزنون? Could this be the last ayah revealed? While it's perfectly possible, I'm not sure that that's one of the aqwal. If it is one of the aqwal, then we can retain that reading of what he's saying. But I have another theory about what Ibn Juzayy is saying. And by the way, Sheikh Tayyar's book didn't really shed light on this, unfortunately. I think that by ayatul riba, he might actually be referring to ayatul dain, which is verse 282. And it can be called ayatul riba by extension because it's part of the discussion about riba. It's about writing down loans. Of course, it's not directly referencing riba, but it's referencing loans within the same theme. Because one of the famous opinions about the last ayah to be revealed is the one before it, which is 281. وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ ثُمَّ تُوَفَّى كُلُّ نَفْسٍ مَا كَسَبَتْ وَهُمْ لَا يُظْلَمُونَ. That's a famous opinion that 281 was the last ayah to be revealed. So I think he's actually saying the verse of riba, by which he means ayatul dain, or the one before it. Right? So this is, and the opinion that ayatul riba was the last, afwan, the opinion that ayatul dain is the last one to be revealed is also mentioned by As-Suyuti. And in the end, he says this is all sort of similar statements, because when some of them refer to ayatul dain or ayatul riba or the one before it, they just meant that this whole passage came in one go, and it wasn't necessarily important to specify which exact one was the last one to be revealed. They may be referring to the first one in the passage, just like he said the last thing to be revealed was إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ. He's not meaning the first ayah, he means the whole surah. And in actual fact, he said Surah tu إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ, right? So he made that explicit. So I'm going to put in the footnote something. I was hoping to say, okay, this is my opinion, and then I checked Sheikh Tayyar, and he said that, so you can, so you know, like Ibn Juzayy does, you mention someone in order to make use of their authority, right? But I wasn't able to do it, so you either take my opinion or you take whatever else that you want. Okay, so here possibly referring to two, and the one before it, famously listed among the last verse. Okay. Okay, so obviously we could provide some reference and so on for that. Okay.
وكان القرآن على عهد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مفترقا في الصحف وفي صدور الرجال. فلما توفي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم قعد علي بن أبي طالب رضي الله عنه في بيته فجمعه على ترتيب نزوله، ولو وجد مصحفه لكان فيه علم كبير ولكنه لم يوجد. فلما قتل جماعة من
right, so there was one thing I wanted to check in the translation as well. Okay, yeah, so ربما, I wanted to check how they put ربما. So ربما does mean sometimes. Although, you know, in common speech nowadays we use ربما for maybe. Okay, but ربما is for تقليل. So on some occasions, right? In a version, okay, we've done this, and then okay, the breasts of men, I mean, hopefully that's still something people understand, okay, but that's, it was more what was catching my eye is saying men is not to exclude that there were hafizat, okay, but you know, a lot of times the word al-rijal we could instead go with people, okay, when it's not intended specifically to refer to men. On occasions it is, of course. When the Messenger ﷺ died, then Ali, okay, so this is mentioned. It may be worth putting a footnote along the lines of what we have in this edition, which is mentioning things about that report and some issues with the claim that Ali radiallahu anhu had a mushaf. Okay, but I'll leave aside this mas'ala for now. Then we have the Battle of Yamama. Okay, we might put capital for D, you know, to indicate this sort of sense of the day of Yamama, meaning the battle. I don't think there's a reason for that to be italics because it's a place, as far as I understand.
يوم اليمامة في قتال مسيلمة الكذاب أشار عمر بن الخطاب على أبي بكر الصديق رضي الله عنهما بجمع القرآن مخافة أن يذهب بموت القراء، فجمعه في صحف غير مرتب السور، وبقيت تلك الصحف عند أبي بكر الصديق، ثم عند عمر بعده، ثم عند بنته حفصة أم المؤمنين. وانتشرت في خلال ذلك صحف كتبت في الآفاق عن الصحابة، وكان بينها اختلاف، فأشار حذيفة.
So let me just check what they put here in the square brackets. So at that time there continued to be various suhuf, you know, pages that people had written and copied from the copies of the Sahaba, right? Or from the Sahaba conveying it to them, right? Which have been written from copies or portions belonging to the Quran, so that's fine.
اليمان على عثمان بن عفان بجمع الناس على مصحف واحد خيفة من اختلافهم، فانتدب لذلك عثمان وأمر زيد بن ثابت بجمعه وجعل معه 3 من قريش.
So we are missing this point about Asharah Hudayfa. So we've got missing text here that Hudayfa brought this issue to Uthman, who then commissioned Zayd. فانتدب لذلك عثمان وأمر زيد. So not commissioned and ordered. These are both not attached to what he did to Zayd. Anyway, basically Uthman took on that suggestion. I may think of another way to put it later. وأمر زيد بجمعه وجعل معه 3 من قريش. He appointed 3 of Quraysh with him. Okay, not Zayd who then gathered it, right? بجمعه. Okay, he ordered him to gather it. And then he appointed these 3.
عبد الله بن الزبير بن العوام وعبد الرحمن بن الحارث بن هشام وسعيد بن العاص بن أمية، وقال لهم: إذا اختلفتم في شيء فاجعلوه بلغة قريش. وجعلوا المصحف الذي كان عند حفصة إماما في هذا الجمع الأخير، وكان عثمان رضي الله عنهم يتعهدهم ويشاركهم في ذلك. فلما كمل المصحف نسخ عثمان رضي الله عنه منه نسخا، ووجهها إلى الأمصار، وأمر بما سواها من المصاحف أن تحرق أو تخرق يروى.
So wrote copies as in made copies of it. So they're using the word copy for mushaf. This is maybe a problem, right? They use the copy. Okay, because then you're going to get confusion between copies and copies of copies, right? So the mushaf, وَجَعْلُ الْمُصْحَفَ الَّذِي كَانَ عِنْدَ حَفْصَةٍ. So even to call that the mushaf is a bit of a problem because that's a suhuf that was with Hafsa, right? Right, so we're going to have to just note that, okay? In fact, it's even possible, I say, that there is some tahrif in the text of Ibn Juzayy here. He may have actually written وَجَعْلُ الصُّحُفِ. It was a very easy mistake for a meme to creep in, right? But then you get upset, I make claims without investigation, right? I'm not going to go look at the manuscripts, but yani, a lot of times my intuition ends up being borne out by manuscripts. الذي كان عند حفصة إماما في هذا الجمع الأخير. Okay, إماما, they've used the word model, which is quite cool actually, as a model in this last collection. Uthman supported them. يتعهدهم ويشاركهم. I'm not sure يتعهد is the way of being supported, but I'll have to look at that. يشاركهم في ذلك. When it was completed, he made copies of it. I've changed that already. نسخ منه نسخا ووجهها to the capital cities. Okay, so the main, capital cities is maybe not the term, but it's like the regional centers. Right. He ordered the other I might just highlight that so that we consider it. He ordered the other copies of the Quran be torn up or burnt. Now this is interesting, all this little insertion here. Oh yeah, no, it's part of the text. وَأَمَرَ أَن تُحْرَقْ أَوْ تُخْرَقْ. Okay. Now, if you put it in round brackets, I think that at times the translators have used round brackets for their own insertions. So, and we're not going. I don't think that the Arabic text is going to be kept in the print. It's actually possible, but it's like nowhere else in the whole translation do we have Arabic text being used. We will use transliteration, so I'll change that. Okay, some points coming in. Men might refer to Katabatul Wahi. No, Sudur al-Rijal. So Katabatul Wahi is not the issue. It's the Huffaz. But from where do we know that all the... Okay, so there's somebody responding to yeah. You're having an argument in the comment section. Right, good.
الحاء المهملة والخاء المنقوطة. فترتيب السور على ما هو الآن عليه هو من فعل عثمان وزيد بن ثابت والذين كتبوا معه المصحف. وقد قيل.
By the way, I'm not actually aware that there were women who memorized the whole Quran, but my point is that if we're told that so-and-so, and we're told a list of a few people who memorized the whole Quran, does it mean that we know that others didn't? And does it mean that if we're told about men who did, that we know that women didn't? I think it's quite likely that women did, the wives of the Prophet ﷺ. But do we necessarily have that information? No. It's just that we don't have to then insist that only fi sudur rijal dun an-nisa, because that's not the meaning, and he's not actually saying that. He's not making that point at all. It just means in people's hearts.
إنه من فعل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وذلك ضعيف ترده الآثار الواردة في ذلك.
Right, so we'd need some, probably some references here. Now, the common assumption, I think, of most people, including scholars who talk about this, is that the order of the surahs is divinely selected, right? Divinely appointed, and the Prophet ﷺ then made sure that the order of the surahs was given in the order that we have it, from the Fatiha to An-Nas in exactly the same sequence. Okay. However, it is commonly accepted by earlier scholars that that order is not exactly dictated by the Prophet ﷺ, right? So to some extent, they would have got that from the Prophet ﷺ, and it may actually match what the Prophet ﷺ had indicated to them, but there's no strong evidence really for the for that to have been dictated to them, right? You can just infer that they probably did. You know, it would have been hard for them to figure it out by themselves. But we have some narrations that talk about their disagreements about it on certain points, and we have some ahadith that seem to indicate that the order was still a matter of development during the revelation of the Quran, right? Such as when the Prophet ﷺ was praying and then he recited, I don't want to misquote it, but he recited the surahs in a sequence which was, you know, Al-Baqarah, Al-Imran, and Nisa in a different sequence, okay, which indicates that perhaps their order was different at that time. That's one way to understand those reports. That's all I'm saying. Okay, so it is actually, as Ibn Juzayy says, it may be stronger to say the other way around, that the order of the surahs is a matter of ijtihad of the Sahaba. Okay. Now, is it possible to get other evidences that support the view that because there's something miraculous about the order, there's too much perfection and munasabah for that to be from the Sahaba? Okay, we can make that argument for sure. Okay, but what we're referring to here is what the reports indicate.
وأما نقط القرآن وشكله فأول من فعل ذلك الحجاج بن يوسف بأمر عبد الملك بن مروان، وزاد الحجاج تحزيبه، وقيل أول من نقطه يحيى بن يعمر، وقيل أبو الأسود الدؤلي.
So they've written hizbs without explaining what the hizbs are. Now, I would need to investigate this because tahzib is, of course, splitting into hizb as a portion. We have something now in the Quran, especially in the sort of the Arab masahif, right? So in the Indo-Pak masahif, we've got subcontinent ones, we've got ruku' division, rukus, and then in the Arab type ones, we tend to have the hizb. But does that mean that Hajjaj divided it in that way, right? According to, you've got the juz, and then you've got half the juz, and then you've got the hazab in between, like 8 here and there. It's not necessary that by tahzib he means that specific hizb division that we know now. Tahzib could simply mean dividing it into portions. He hasn't mentioned here the division into ajza, 30 ajza. So, we need to clarify what he means by tahzib here. We don't want something anachronistic to come through. Like, to be right, hizb is, what is it, a quarter? It's an eighth of a juz, right?
أما وضع الأعشار فيه فقيل إن الحجاج فعل ذلك، وقيل بل أمر به المأمون العباسي.
Now, they've said tenths for a'shar. A'shar is groups of 10. Groups of 10. Yes, so a'shar in a common word, as a word generally means tenths. But I think that what he means here is after every 10 verses, they would put a special mark to help with the count.
وأما أسماؤه فهي 4: القرآن والفرقان والكتاب والذكر، وسائر ما يسمى به صفات لا أسماء.
So there's a point here about Ya'mar and biographical note. Why for Ya'mar? Is Yahya ibn Ya'mar is mentioned here, unless you mean him. But for sure, like if we're giving biographies for the others, then why not him? I mean, that's just for consistency as well. I mean, if we're giving biographical notes for some, then we wouldn't miss out others. Sometimes you might have a policy of, for example, if there's a whole isnad and multiple names are mentioned there, do you have to give a biographical note for each one? It sort of depends what you're doing. But for here, there would be no difference. He's mentioned in the same kind of context as everybody else.
به بالعظيم والكريم والمبين والعزيز والمجيد وغير ذلك.
Okay, so he's going on to another point here, which is the names of the Quran. He is taking the view that there are 4 names of the Quran. Some expand the names of the Quran to a very long list, and some have a shorter list than Ibn Juzayy. So he's gone with 4, which should be considered as names proper, right? As opposed to things which are attributes. And again, sort of vast is to me a little bit strange as the way of understanding Azim and Al-Quran Al-Azim. There's not got all of them here. Al-Azim, Kareem, then there's Mubin. Okay, Al-Aziz, Al-Majid, etc. So then he explains the 4 names.
فأما القرآن فأصله مصدر قرأ ثم أطلق على المقروء وأما الفرقان فمصدر أيضا معناه التفرقة بين الحق والباطل وأما الكتاب فمصدر ثم أطلق على المكتوب وأما الذكر فسمي القرآن به لما فيه من ذكر الله أو من التذكير والمواعظ.
Okay, so the word Quran, he's saying, is a masdar from qara'a, which is to recite, simply speaking, and then so recital, or recitation itself would be the meaning, right? So to make it a bit clearer what we mean by the verbal noun, that is to say recitation. And we're not going to keep the Arabic text. He recited, I'm not sure if we would keep that form, right? But we'll come back to this later. ثُمَّ أُطْلِقَ عَلَى الْمَقْرُوءِ. Because when he says masdar qara'a, he's just referring to the verb, not to the conjugation qara'a. He recited, per se. And then it was generalized. So utliqa doesn't mean generalized here. So they've gone with the thought that utliqa is from like mutlaq versus muqayyad, right? But itlaq in this context means it was used for. It's a linguistic usage. So they've been misled by another aspect, another itlaq of itlaq, funnily enough. For we don't need this really, the square brackets, because al-maqru is the thing which is recited. For that which is recited, i.e. the passive participle, that's fine. Okay, they've got that right. And now they have a long footnote here. Using fa'ala, we have fi'l or fa'il, maf'ul. That is how Arabic grammar works with doing, do or done. Might review this footnote in terms of what we need to say here really. As for Furqan, it's also a verbal noun, which means to distinguish. So criterion here is a noun rather than a verbal noun, right? Although it's fine as a translation of Furqan, but he wants to say it means tafriqa, right? Which is the distinguishing between haqq and batil, right? So he's trying to explain that meaning and how it's a verbal noun. وَأَمَّا الْكِتَابِ is also a verbal noun. So the problem is in English, we don't always have a verbal noun. It's often we have to use the ing, right? We're intending the verbal noun, but the ing can also be a gerund, and so it's a bit ambiguous. That's why I went with recitation. Recitation is clearly the noun. Writing, I mean here the noun, writing, but it's a little bit unclear, perhaps, for many readers. but the act of writing is what is in it. The act of writing is the meaning of al-kitab. ثم أطلق على المكتوب. Then this verbal noun is used also for the thing which is written. So not generalized, but used for that which is written. So for a piece of writing, for example, a book. But al-kitab also, like, so a lot of times the word book is the appropriate translation for it, and okay, kitabullah, the book of Allah, that's fine. But this is a very good example of al-wujuh wal-nadha'ir, right? In many places in the Quran, the word book is not the appropriate way to understand the word kitab. It could be anything written. It could be a letter. It could be, so Bilqis receives a letter from Sulaiman. She says, she refers as kitabun kareem. It doesn't mean she got a book, right? Sulaiman sent her a book, you know, through, not Amazon, through the Hudhud. But the Hudhud brought her what? A letter, right? Something written, maktub. That's kitab. In other places, it may be more abstract, the writ and the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But we'll pass over this issue for now. وَأَمَّا الذِّكْر, why is it called dhikr? Which hasn't been actually translated here. So it's tricky because it could mean a whole bunch of things. It could mean the reminder or the remembrance. It could mean the message, right? But given the way he's explaining it, فَسُمِّيَ الْقُرْآنُ بِهِ لِمَا فِيهِ مِنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, because of the remembrance of Allah Azza wa Jalla in it, or because of the reminder, it's because of its reminders and admonishments. Let's put it that way. Okay, and then there's a little note about the words surah and ayah.
ويجوز في السورة من القرآن الهمز وترك الهمز لغة قريش. وأما الآية فأصلها العلامة، ثم سميت الجملة من القرآن آية لأنها علامة على صدق النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم.
Right, so ويجوز في السورة. So it's not clear from this translation that he's talking about something about the word. Right, so that is to say, it is allowed to pronounce it as surah. However, without Hamza, surah is a dialect of Quraysh. As for the ayah, its original sense, asluha, that's one way to put asl, okay, is sign, alama, and then the sentence, and then they put in brackets verse or phrase from Quran was called that because it is a sign of the truth, and because it is, let's say each ayah in the Quran is a sign of the truth of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right, so it's good that they notice that a jumla shouldn't really be understood here as referring to a sentence in a grammatical meaning, right? Because some ayat contain multiple jumal and some are shorter than a jumla. So what he means is a unit. So I'm going to say then, I'm going to use the word unit here to indicate what he means by jumla, like a portion, a little piece. The smallest unit of the Quran in its own usage, right? But beyond that, of course, you have a word of the ayah and so on. Right, question here, would the infinitive be appropriate to write instead of writing? You could go with the infinitive, but the problem is the infinitive, after saying it's a verbal noun, would be slightly at odds. It is a verbal noun meaning to write. It's no problem, but to write is a verb, right? So I think that would be tricky to say verbal noun and then put in the brackets to write. That's my personal preference on the matter. Okay, let's see how we're doing for time. The thing is that our next chapter about Makki and Madani is very short, and I don't have to say much about it at the moment. So what we can do is we can simply read that, inshallah. A question coming in: do I have to justify these edits to the translator? No.
الباب الثاني في السور المكية والمدنية. اعلم أن السور المكية هي التي نزلت بمكة، ويعد منها كل ما نزل قبل الهجرة وإن نزل بغير مكة، كما أن المدنية هي السور التي نزلت بالمدينة، ويعد منها كل ما نزل بعد الهجرة وإن نزل بغير المدينة.
Okay, so it's a simple point here, which many people don't know this, but it's helpful to know. When we talk about Makki and Madani, it is a time division rather than a place one per se, right? So although the difference is the hijrah, which is to do with place, generally speaking, the category Makki applies to everything before hijrah, and Madani everything after hijrah, right? Regardless of whether the Prophet ﷺ was outside somewhere when the revelation happened. Okay. The surahs are divided into 3 categories.
وتنقسم السور 3 أقسام. قسم مدنية باتفاق وهي 22 سورة، وهي البقرة وآل عمران والنساء والمائدة والأنفال وبراءة والنور والأحزاب والقتال والفتح والحجرات والحديد والمجادلة والحشر والممتحنة والصف والجمعة والمنافقون والتغابن والطلاق والتحريم وإذا جاء نصر الله.
So it's interesting, he doesn't, both times he didn't refer to the surah as Surah Al-Nasr, but he referred to it as Surah إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ. So, I mean, they've stuck with his wording in that regard. I wouldn't see it as a problem here to replace that with just the short name for Surah Al-Nasr, which is, and again here they have not provided the translation. They used the translation for all of the surah names, except for this one. Right, so I see a small inconsistency here, which is an understandable one because it's a distinction in the original text. Okay, but we might need some clarification, that's all. Immunity. Surah At-Tawbah. So this is confusing, right? Because what they've said is immunity, by which they mean bara'a. And they've translated bara'a as immunity, and then they put in the footnote, i.e. Surah At-Tawbah, using the Arabic term for the other name of Surah At-Tawbah. But if you said immunity and then footnote, i.e. repentance, you mean immunity means repentance? It'll be very confusing, right? So you need to have a good kind of system here. And one of our students is reminding me as well that I have a tendency to change this word to spoils, to avoid maybe some misreadings in the modern day. وقسم فيها خلاف. Okay.
وقسم فيها خلاف هل هي مكية أو مدنية، وهي 13 سورة: القرآن والرعد والنحل والحج والإنسان والمطففين والقدر ولم يكن وإذا زلزلت وأرأيت والإخلاص والمعوذتان.
Okay, so in these ones there is some difference of opinion. Okay, so we have got here al-Quran, which is the Fatiha. See, what they could do is also put the surah numbers, make it a little bit easier for people. Why not? Okay, so I'll put that there just as an indicator that, because some of these translations as well, you're going to think, what surah is he even talking about? Yeah, some of them might be difficult to figure out, and not everybody has that level of familiarity that they'll know the surah that's being referred to just from a translation of the title, especially something like immunity. People are like, what? Like, this herd immunity, COVID-19. People are not going to know what immunity is. Bara'a. Oh, when they put Surah At-Tawbah. Okay, maybe that helps with that one, but only because the point is it's an alternative name, not because the translation might be unfamiliar to people. Yeah, some of these I'm struggling with. I can figure them all out, but it's like a quiz, you know? Yeah. Why not leave the name in Arabic? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm saying. Leave the name in Arabic and maybe put the translation in brackets. That would make sense. But they've used a strategy here, which I think was غير موفق. Then al-Quran, thunder, the bee, okay. Pilgrimage, man, stinters, power, or the decree. I mean, that's, now you've put, like, I'm giving you alternative translations for al-Qadr. Then Surah Al-Bayyinah, again, you know, this kind of inconsistency in the way. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ وَإِذَا زُلْزِلَتْ وَأَرَأَيْتْ. Sincerity. Sincerity is not really the good translation of Al-Ikhlas anyway here, but it's purity of creed. وَالْمُعَوِّذَتَانِ. And the two by means of which we just saw Al-Mu'awwidhatan, which also then needs to be clarified what those are, right? So this is kind of my point. A lot of the times I'm saying to you, think about the reader, think about the miskeen sitting at home. No, no offense intended to anyone. Just they're not. I mean, we are ourselves masakin, but there are people who are in a greater state of maskana than us, and they're going to read this, and you want them to get something from it. And like you need to give them something, like clarify. Think about the person reading it. Are they going to understand or not? If they're not, then you need to do something about it. Either you intervene in the in the main part of the text with some brackets, or you think about how you translate it, and then where needed you give footnotes. Okay. Al-Mu'awwidhatan, Al-Mu'awwidhatan, not Al-Mu'awwadhatan. But in any case, it is the those are Al-Falaq and An-Nas.
وقسم مكية باتفاق وهي سائر السور، وقد وقعت آيات مدنية في سور مكية كما وقعت آيات مكية في سور مدنية، وذلك قليل مختلف في أكثره.
Okay, so sometimes Medina verses occur in a Meccan surah. So by implication, you can see that that happens a fair amount, right? So you've got a Meccan surah, and then a few ayat came into the surah at a later point, right? So that seems like something that would happen a fair amount, right? But he says just as, well, the translation says just as. I might use a different way of putting it just to make it clearer that these are, we're talking about two quite different things. And Meccan verses may occur in a Medina surah, which is to say, in Mecca, a few ayat were revealed, right? Or one ayah was revealed, and then later a whole surah came in Medina, and this ayah was made to be part of that surah. So you can see that that kind of setup is a little less intuitive. Therefore, it happens less. مختلف في أكثره, and there are different views about most of them. So what he's really saying here, to put it a bit more clearly, is there dispute about most of those cases, which is to say, some might not affirm any case where that happens, right?
واعلم أن السور المكية نزل أكثرها في إثبات العقائد والرد على المشركين وفي قصص الأنبياء، وأن السور المدنية نزل أكثرها في الأحكام الشرعية وفي الرد على اليهود والنصارى وذكر المنافقين والفتوى في مسائل وذكر غزوات النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، وحيثما ورد يا أيها الذين آمنوا فهو مدني، وأما يا أيها الناس فقد وقع في المكي والمدني.
Okay, so these are some kind of general themes of the Makki and the Madani, and it is also some rules of thumb about identifying things that are Makki and Madani, right? So this is helpful, but to an extent, you should be a little bit careful about it. So first of all, the Meccan themes. So the fi here means concerning. So we shouldn't have the word in the translation. Know that most of the Meccan surahs were revealed in in affirmation of, that's okay, they've done something with it. Tenets of belief, refutation of people of shirk. I don't think generally they use the word people of shirk for mushrikeen in the whole translation. In the whole translation, it tends to say the idolaters, and they keep spelling it with an O-R. So I've changed it to ER. In refutation of the people of shirk, and in narration of the stories of the prophets. Okay, so then they've done something with the in as well. To be honest, that's not bad then. The ins, they've done something with them. Otherwise, you would change it to confirming, concerning. Revealed concerning tenets of belief and refutation of people of shirk, and concerning stories. I prefer what they've got, to be honest, and I'll be fair to them whenever I can. Most of the Medina surahs were revealed about, okay, that's fine, fi can mean about as well, judgments of the Sharia. So I've tended to put, instead of judgments, I put rulings. So legal rulings, let's say al-ahkam al-shar'iyya, legal rulings. وفي الرد على اليهود والنصارى, as opposed to the mushrikeen, in mention of the hypocrites, okay, rulings on certain questions. Okay, so fatwa, they've used ruling for fatwa. So I might have to use a different term here if I'm going with rulings for ahkam. And a mention of the battles of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So in saying that, he's not limiting the themes to these things, but the main reason he's mentioning this is so that when we recognize these things being talked about, we are aware that, okay, we're looking at things that are Meccan most likely, versus we're looking at things that are Medinan most likely. Because of course, the encounter with Yahud and Nasara was later for the most part. But does that mean we can't have points made about Yahud and Nasara in the Meccan Quran? No, it does not mean that at all. Okay, and this is an important point to keep in mind. Secondly, does it mean that once he got to Medina, then there was no more refutation of shirk and mushrikeen? No, it doesn't mean that at all. But there's just a general guide about what kind of themes are going to be developing. Okay, and a mention of the battles of the Prophet ﷺ. So obviously the battles did occur in Medina, so any reference to things happening in the battle is definitely Medina. Wherever we see Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, as many scholars have noted, it is Madani. I think that is a correct statement. I don't know if there's any sort of responses that's been made to that. But nicely he said Ya ayyuhan nas occurs in both, because sometimes people have said Ya ayyuhan nas is a Meccan thing and Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu is a Medinan thing, but he's been more precise in the way that he's put it here. Right, so I'll just have a look at any final questions before wrapping up, inshallah. Is Surah Al-Qital referring to Surah Muhammad? Yes, it is. And then we've got here legal verdicts for fatwa. It could be. Yeah, I've highlighted things to come back to later. Verdicts is fine without necessarily being legal, because fatwa, I don't want to restrict it to legal matters, right? Because that's your typical understanding as a later thing, not the Quran giving fatwa, right? So the fatwa in the Quran could be for that. Yusuf alayhi salam says to the fellow prisoners, قُضِيَ الْأَمْرُ الَّذِي فِيهِ تَسْتَفْتِيَانِ. So they were asking for fatwa on their dreams. So it could be broader than that. So I'd rather just use a broader word like verdicts. Question here about, are there any discussion from scholars of a marked change in linguistic style, cadence, syntax of Meccan versus Medinan, as opposed to subject matter? I think there are things which are a bit more extensive than what Ibn Juzayy has mentioned here, but maybe not to the extent of what is sort of the current hot things in Western Quranic studies, of trying to identify Meccan versus Medinan, or early versus late, or different phases. And they might split these into multiple phases, not just the two phases, Meccan versus Medinan. they might say there are like 3 Meccan phases and then 2 Medinan phases or whatever. And then they try to identify that using linguistic markers and other things along these lines. And then also some other type of even computational techniques that can be used to assess. Mean verse length is one of the things that's being talked about. All of that has precedence in the work of the Muslim ulama, but I'm not sure the extent to which it is along these lines, as you say, linguistic style, cadence, syntax. But certain types of phrases have been noted, and I'm sure they must have said something about length of ayahs, I think, to some extent. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam. And inshallah, we'll wrap up here for today. وصلى الله وسلم على سيدنا محمد وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.